yesterday. Um, I went to downtown Chicago to get an ID. I went to the Loop in Chicago, and they didn't tell me that there was two DMVs that you can go get your licenses at, or like any state ID, something like that. I was in line yesterday for 6 hours before I eventually got into the building, but I had to lose my spot 3 times. But I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail with it. But I had to get out of line once to go use the bathroom at a McDonald's across the street, and then the lady told us if we got out of line, then we had to start back over again. And then I lost my spot on line again because I had a birth certificate copy, and they didn't take the copy. I had to get the original, so I had to lose my spot on line again, go to the courthouse down the street to get an original, and then get back in line. And then about an hour before they were to close, they said they had another building off Monroe that also was a DMB, and we could go there also and get an ID. I was in Chicago yesterday from 11 in the morning to like 8 at night yesterday. Um, but if you're interested, there was a video I put up on my other channel yesterday called RBW King, where I actually toured the Torture Museum. If you want to see videos of the torture, if you want to see a video of the Torture Museum and what they have in downtown Chicago, you can check out that video. And it was a pretty great. It was on the live stream yesterday. Um, so if you're interested in like horror stuff, like and like horror stuff, like the torture museum stuff, that's a video you should check out. So today on this channel we're going to talk about vampires. Um, Vampires have been around for years. My two favorite vampire movies are Blade and Underworld, where they have the fight with them. Where the Underworld movie they had the fight between the vampires and werewolves. But Blade was a good one too with Wesley Snipes. Those are like my two favorite ones. Um, so a vampire is a mythical creature that subsists by feeding on the vital essence, generally in the form of blood of the living. Now vampires couldn't go out in sunlight or they burned to death. That's how they portrayed it in the movie Blade. And that's how they portrayed it in the movie Underworld also. Um, Now, in European folklore, vampires are undead humanoid creatures that often have visited loved ones and cause mischief or deaths in the neighborhoods which they inhabited while they were alive. Now, they wore shrouds and were often described as bloated and of ruddy or dark countenance. They were marked differently um, from today's gaunt, pale vampire, which dates from the early 19th century. Now, in vampiric entities, they often been recorded in cultures around the world. Now, the term vampire was popularized back in the 18th century during the big mass hysteria, a pre-existing folk belief in southeastern and eastern Europe that in some cases it resulted in um, corpse being staked and people being accused of vampirism. Now, good. Um, it's a good thing that you subbed. Was it FR Sharpie? I can't read the whole name there, but yeah, good thing that you subbed. Um, Now local variants in southeastern Europe were also known by different names such as Shritriga um, Shritriga in Albania, or in Vraikolakis in Greece, and Strigoi in Romania, and it's cognate to Italian strega, meaning witch. Um, Now in modern times, the vampire is generally held to be a fictitious entity. Although belief in similar vampiric creatures, such as the chupacabra, still exist in some still exist and persists in some cultures. I've heard of the chupacabra. I could probably put a video up on that later on in the next week or so. Um, it still persists in some cultures. Now, early folk belief in vampires have sometimes been has been ascribed to the ignorance of the body's process of decomposition after death, and how people in pre-industrial societies tried to rationalize this, creating the figure of the vampire to explain the mysteries of death. Um, Now, Peripheria was linked with the legends of vampirism in 1985, and it received much media exposure, but has since been largely discredited. Now, now the charismatic and sophisticated vampire of modern fiction was born in 1819 with the publication of The Vampire by the English writer John Polidori. Um, Hello, Sheila. It's good to see that people are hopping on. Um, Thank you for all who has joined. Um, Now, the story was highly successful and arguably the most influential vampire book of the early 19th century, and also like Bram Stoker's 1897 novel. So Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula is remembered as the quintessential vampire novel and provided the basis of the modern vampire legend. Um, Even though it was published after fellow Irish author Joseph Sheridan Le Fano's 1872 novel Carmilla, the success of this book spawned a distinctive vampire genre, which is still popular in the 21st century. Um, Now, with books, films, television shows, and video games, the vampire has since become a dominant figure in the horror genre. Um, Now, the exact etymology of the vampire is unclear in how it came to be. Um, Now, the word vampire finds its earliest records in English, Latin, and French, and references to vampirism were found in Russia, Poland, and Macedonia. Um, the English term was derived possibly from the French, meaning the French vampire, which they spelt it Vampyre, or the German word vampire spelt Vampir. Um, in turn, it derived in the early 18th century from Serbia, though this being a popular explanation, a pagan worship of Upri was already arrested in Old Russian in the 11th to 13th century. Now, some claim an origin from Lithuania, Oxford, and others, and they maintain a Turkish origin. Um, Turkish meaning Uber or Uber meaning which passed to English via Hungarian and French derivation. Now, in addition, others sustain that the modern word vampire is derived from the Old Slavic and Turkic languages, with the addition of the V sound in front of the large nasal vowel on, characteristic of Old Bulgarian. Now, parallels of this word are often found virtually in all Slavic and Turkic languages, Bulgarian and Macedonian, Turkish, Tatar, Chuvash, Bynap, Bosnian, Croatian, Czech, and Slovakic. And then you got Polish, and perhaps East Slavic, and Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, and Old East Slavic. Now, many of these languages have also been borrowed, have also borrowed forms such as vampire, subsequently from the West, and these are distinct from the original local words for the pre-creature. In Albania, the words Lovgat and Dampir are also used. Now, the latter, Dampir, seems to be derived from the Albanian words dam, dam tooth, which they spell Dham, and per to drink. So dam means tooth, and per means to drink. Okay, makes sense. The origin of the modern word vampire, Upirior, means horton. Vampire are witch in Turkic and Slavic myths. It comes from the term Ubir, Upior. The origin of the word Ubir or Upirior is based on the regions around the Volga, the Volga River or Pontic Steppes. The Upir myth is through the migration of the Kipchak Kuman people to the Eurasian steppes allegedly spread. Now, the Bulgarian format is the word Vipir, meaning it's spelled Vpir, and other names have been used. The Czechoslovakian linguist Václav Mašek proposes the Slavic verb bripret, sa stick, sa, meaning to stick, meaning to stick or to thrust into. It's a hypothetical anagram, in Czechoslovakian, and it also means to turn, and it also can mean to thrust violently. Um, as an etymological background, and thus translates, you appear as someone who thrusts and bites. The term was introduced to German readers by the Polish Jesuit priest Gabriel um, 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 Razazinski back in 1721. Um, Now the word vampire, I'm gonna also eat too, so as to not get my food cold. Um, Having a breakfast bowl called Meat Lovers Bowl. Okay, move on. Okay, so now the word vampire first appeared in English language in 1732, and so like I was saying, the word vampire first appeared in the English language back in 1732, in news reports about vampire epidemics in Western and Eastern Europe. After Austria gained control of northern Siberia and Olshenia with the Treaty of the Passauritz in 1718, officials noted the local practice of exhuming bodies and killing vampires. Now, these reports were prepared between 1725 and 1732, and they received widespread publicity. Um, the notion of vampirism has existed for millennia. Cultures such as the Mesopotamians, Hebrews, ancient Greeks, Manipuri, and Romans had tales of demons and spirits which are considered precursors to modern vampires. Now, despite the occurrence of vampiric creatures in these ancient civilizations, the folklore for the entity known today as the vampire originates almost exclusively from early 18th century southeastern Europe. Now, with verbal traditions of many ethnic groups of the region were recorded and published, in most cases, vampires are remnants of evil beings, suicide victims, or witches. But they can also be created by malevolent spirit possessing a corpse or by being bitten by a vampire. Belief in such legends become so pervasive that in some areas it caused mass hysteria and even public executions for people believing to be vampires. That's the same thing that happened with the Salem witch trials. In the Salem witch trials, a lot of people that were innocent got killed because a story was spread that these people were practicing witchcraft, which they weren't, and that led to like over 20 people being executed back then, either by being hung to death or pressing, and that was a big hysteria back then too. No, it's very difficult to make a single definitive description of the folkloric vampire, though there are several elements common to many European legends. Now, vampires were usually reported as bloated in appearance, and they were ruddy, purplish, or dark in color. Now, these characteristics are often attributed to the recent drinking of blood, which was often seen seeping from the mouth and nose when one was seen in its shroud or coffin, and its left eye was often open. It would be clad in the linen shroud, and it was buried in, and its teeth, hair, and nails may have grown somewhat, though but general things were not a feature. And chewing sounds were reported emanating from the graves. Let's see if there's actual pictures of vampires here. Now here's one of a woman vampire. This is an actual thing called The Vampire by Philip Burne-Jones, back from 1897. Then you got that. This is an illustration of a vampire from Max Ernst's painting from 1934. So you can see those. Now, the causes of vampiric generation were many and varied in original folklore and Slavic and Chinese tradition. Um, any corpse that was jumped over by an animal, particularly a dog or a cat, was feared to become one of the undead. Now, a body with a wound that had not been treated with boiling water was also at risk. In Russian folklore, vampires were often said to have once been witches or people who had rebelled against the Russian Orthodox Church while they were living. Um, in Albanian folklore, the Dampir is the hybrid child um, of the Karkenhol, a lycanthropic creature with an iron male shirt, or the Lugat, a water dwelling ghost or monster. The Dampir sprung of a Karkenhol, which has the unique ability to discern the Karkenhol. From this it derives the expression of the Dampir knows the Lugat. The Lugat cannot be seen. He can only be killed by the Dampir, who himself is usually the son of a Lugat. Now, in different regions, animals can be represented as Lugats, also living people during their sleep. And Dampir is also an Albanian surname. The prevention, um, so and with cultural practices often arose that were intended to prevent a recently deceased loved one from turning into an undead revenant. Um, Now, burying a corpse upside down was widespread, as was placing earthly objects such as skips or sickles near the grave to satisfy any demons entering the body, or to appease the dead so that it could not wish to arise from its coffin. Now, this method resembles the ancient Greek practice of placing an obelisk in the corpse's mouth to pay the toll to cross the river Styx in the underworld. Um, the coin may have also been intended to ward off any evil spirits from entering the body, and this may have influenced later vampire folklore. Now, this tradition persisted in modern Greek folklore about the Vrykolakus, in which a wax cross and a piece of pottery with the inscription Jesus Christ conquers were placed on the corpse to prevent the body from becoming a vampire. Now, other methods commonly used in Europe included severing the tendons at the knees or placing poppy seeds, the millet, or sand on the ground at the gravesite of a presumed vampire. Now, this was intended to keep the vampire occupied all night by counting the fallen grains. Now, indicating an association of vampires with the arithmonia. Similar Chinese narratives state that if a vampire became if a vampiric being came across a sack of rice, it would have to count every grain. And this is a theme encountered in many myths from the Indian subcontinent, as well as South American tales of witch and other sorts of evil or mischievous spirits began. Um, many rituals were used to identify a vampire. Um, one one method of finding a vampire's grave involved leading a virgin through a graveyard or church grounds on a virgin stallion. The horse would supposedly balk at the grave in question. Generally, a black horse is required, though in Albania, and even Albania said it should be white. Now, holes appearing in the earth over a grave were taken as a sign of as vampirism. Um, Now, corpses thought to be vampires were generally described as having a healthier appearance than expected, plump and showing little or no signs of decomposition. Um, in some cases, when suspected graves were opened, villagers often described the corpse as having fresh blood from a victim all over its face, evidence that a vampire was active in a given locality, included death of cattle, sheep, relatives, or neighbors. Um, Folkloric vampires could also make their presence felt by engaging in minor poltergeist-styled activity, such as hurling stones on roofs or moving household objects and pressing on people in their sleep. Um, Apotropics items were able to ward off revenants are common in vampire folklore. Garlic is a common example. Um, a branch of wild rose and hawthorn are sometimes associated with causing harm to vampires, and in Europe, mustard seeds would be sprinkled on the roof of a house to keep them away. Now, other apotropics include sacred water are unable to walk onto consecrated ground, such as meaning churches or temples or cross running water. Um, although this is not traditionally regarded as an apotropic, mirrors um, mirrors have been used to ward off vampires when placed facing outwards on a door. In some cultures, vampires do not have a reflection, and sometimes do not cast a shadow, perhaps as a manifestation of the vampire's lack of a soul or their weakness to silver. Um, Now, this attribute is not universal. The Greek Bricolaus was capable of both reflection and shadow, but was used by Bram Stoker and Dracula, and it's remained popular with subsequent authors and filmmakers to this day. Um, Now, some traditions also hold that a vampire cannot enter a house unless invited in by the owner. Um, that's like the movie Let Me In. Um, with the boy and the girl, and the boy didn't know that the girl was a vampire, and he befriended her, and basically she couldn't come in unless he invited her in. And now after the vampire was invited into the house by the owner, then the vampire can come and go as they please. Um, Now, though folkloric vampires were believed to be more active at night, they were generally not considered. They were generally not considered vulnerable to sunlight. Now, reports dating back to 1693 and 1694 concerning sightings of vampires in Poland and Russia claimed that when a vampire's grave was recognized, eating bread baked with its blood mixed into the flour, or simply drinking it, granted the possibility of protection. Other stories, primarily the Arnold po- Arnold, the Arnold Poley case, claimed that the eating of dirt from the vampire's grave would have the same effect. Um, Not sure about all that. Here's a rune, and supposedly the rune indicates to keep the deceased buried in their grave. You can see that right there. Um, Methods of destroying suspected vampires varied. Um, with staking being the most commonly preferred method, particularly in the Slavic cultures. Um, now ash was the preferred wood in Russia and the Baltic states, or hawthorn in Serbia. Um, with a record of oak in Silesia, aspen was also used for stakes, as it was believed that the Christ's cross was made from aspen. Aspen branches being on the graves of the purported vampires were also believed to prevent their risings at night. Um, Now, potential vampires were most often staked through the heart, and though the mouth was targeted in Russia and northern Germany, and the stomach in northeastern Serbia. Um, piercing the skin of the chest was a way of deflating the bloated vampire, but this is similar to a practice of anti-vampire burial, burying sharp objects such as sickles with the corpse so that they may penetrate the skin if the body bloats sufficiently, by transforming into a revenant. Um, Decapitation of a vampire was the preferred method in German and Western Slavic areas, with the head buried between the feet and behind the buttocks, or away from the body. Now, this act was seen as a way of hastening the departure of the soul, which in some cultures was said to linger in the corpse. The vampire's head, body, or clothes could also be spiked and pinned to the earth to prevent rising. Um, Now here is um Now here is an 800-year-old skeleton found in Bulgaria, and it was stabbed through the chest with an iron rod. That is a painful way to go. Um, now the Romani people drove steel or iron needles into a corpse's heart and placed a bit of steel in the mouth, over the eyes, and between the fingers at the time of burial. Now, they also placed hawthorn in the corpse's sock or drove a hawthorn stake through the legs. In the 16th century burial near Venice, a brick forced into the mouth of a female corpse has also been interpreted as a vampire slaying brutal by the archaeologists who discovered it back in 2006. Now, in Bulgaria, over 100 skeletons of metal objects such as plow bits embedded into the torso have also been discovered. Um, Now, further measures include pouring boiling water over the grave or complete incineration of the body. In southeastern Europe, a vampire could also be killed by being shot or drowned by repeating the funeral service, by sprinkling holy water on the body, or by performing an exorcism. In Romania, garlic could be placed in the mouth, and as recently as the 19th century, the precaution of shooting the bullet through the coffin was taken. For resistant cases, the body was dismembered and the pieces burned and mixed with water and administered to family members as a cure. In the Saxon Anglo regions of Germany, and lemon was placed in the mouth of a suspected vampire. Um, in ancient belief, the tales of supernatural beings consuming the blood or flesh of the living have been found in nearly every culture around the world for many centuries. Now, the term vampire did not exist in ancient terms, but blood drinking and similar activities were attributed to demons or spirits who, who would eat, who would eat the flesh and drink blood. Even the devil was considered synonymous with the vampire. Almost every culture associates blood drinking with some kind of revenant or demon, or in some cases a deity. Um, in India, tales of atalas, which are ghoulish beings that inhabit corpse, and they have been compiled in the Batal Pasisi, a prominent story that comes from the tales of King Bakrama Bakramadia, which I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, and his nightly quest to capture an elusive one. In the Pasaka, the returned spirits of evildoers or those who died insane also bear vampiric attributes. Now, the Persians were one of the first civilizations to have tales of blood drinking demons. Um, now, um, Now, the Persians were one of the first civilizations to have tales of blood drinking demons. Um, Creatures attempting to drink blood from men were depicted on excavated pottery shards. now, ancient now ancient Babylonia and Assyria had tales of the mythical um Lilitu. Not sure if I'm saying that right either, and that's synonymous with and giving to Lilith in Hebrew, and her daughters, the Lilu from Hebrew demonology. Now, Lilitu was considered a demon and was often depicted as subsisting on the blood of babies. And Estherese, a female shape-shifting blood-drinking demon, were said to roam the night among the population seeking victims. Um, According to Sefer Hasidim, Estries were creatures created in the twilight hours before God rested. An injured Estrie could be healed by eating bread and salt given to her by her attacker. In Greco-Roman mythology, described the Empusai, the Lamia, the Mormo, and the Strages. Over time, the first two terms became general words to describe witches and demons, respectively. The Empusa was the daughter of the goddess Hecate, and was described as demonic bronze-footed creatures. Um, the only reason why I know this is because that was the NPC was also mentioned in the Percy Jackson book series. Um, Basically, the NPC would feast on blood by transforming into a young woman and seduced the men as they slept before drinking their blood. The Lamia preyed on young children in their beds at night, sucking their blood, as did the Gello. Um, like the Lamia, the Strangers feasted on children, but they also preyed on adults also. They were also described as having the bodies of crows or birds in general, and they were later incorporated into Roman mythology as Strix, a kind of nocturnal bird that fed on human flesh and blood. In Turkish mythology, and a Ubir is a vampiric creature characterized by various regional depictions. Um, According to legend, individuals heavily steeped in sin and practitioners of black magic transform into Ubirs upon their death, taking on a bestial form from within their grave. Um, the Ubirs possess the ability to shapeshift, assuming the forms of both humans and various animals. Furthermore, they can seize the soul of a living being and exert control over its body. Someone inhabited by a vampire constantly experiences hunger, becoming increasingly aggressive when unable to find sustenance, ultimately resorting to drinking human blood. Um, Now here's a picture of it's like a lithograph, and it's supposed to show townsfolk burning the exhumed skeleton, who they thought to be a vampire, right there. So you can see the body in the grave, and it shows so you can see the body in the grave, and it shows the townsfolk people burning the body to prevent it from being a vampire again. Um, Many myths surrounding vampires originated during the medieval period. Now, with the arrival of Christianity in Greece and other parts of Europe, the vampire began to take on a decidedly Christian characteristic. As various regions of the continent converted to Christianity, um, the vampire was viewed as a dead person who retained a semblance of life and could leave his grave much in the same way that Jesus had risen after his death and burial and appeared before his followers. Um, Now, with the Middle Ages, the Christian churches reinterpreted vampires from their previous folk existence into being minions of Satan, and they used an allegory to communicate a doctrine to Christians. Just as a vampire takes a sinner's very spirit into itself by drinking his blood, so also can a righteous Christian by drinking Christ's blood take the divine spirit into himself. Um, Interpretation of vampires. Okay, yeah. So the interpretation of vampires under the Christian churches established connotations that are still associated in the vampire genre today. Um, for example, the ability of the cross to hurt and ward off vampires is distinctly due to its Christian association. Now, the 12th century British historians and chroniclers Walter Map and William of Newburgh recorded accounts of revenants. Um, Now, though records and English legends of vampiric beings after this date are scant, the Old Norse Draugr is another medieval example of an undead creature with similarities to vampires. The vampiric beings were rarely written about in Jewish literature, but the 16th century rabbi David ben Solomon ibn Abi Zimra wrote of an uncharitable old woman whose body was unguarded and unburied for the 3 days after she died, and rose as a vampiric entity, killing hundreds of people. Now he linked this event to the lack of a of a of a, due to the lack of a Shemira guarding after death, as the corpse could be a vessel for evil spirits. In 1645, the Greek librarian of the Vatican, Leo Annalus, produced the first methodological description of the Balkan beliefs and vampires. In his work, um, on certain modern opinions among the Greeks, vampires probably originating in folklore were widely reported from Eastern Europe, dating to the dating late to the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, these tales formed the basis of the vampire legend that later entered Germany and England, where they were subsequently embellished and popularized. An early recording of the time came from the region of Istria and modern Croatia. Now, in 1672, local reports described a panic among the villagers inscribed by the belief that Girgrando had become a vampire after dying in 1656, and he drank blood from victims and sexually harassed his widow. Um, the village leader ordered a stake to be driven through his heart. Later, his corpse was also beheaded. Um, Dating to 1679, Felipe Rohr devotes an essay to the dead who chew their shrouds in their graves, a subject resumed by Otto in 1732, and then by Michael Ranfitch in 1734. Um, the sub The subject was based on the observation that when digging up graves, it was discovered that some corpses had at some point either devoured the interior fabric of their coffin or their own limbs. Um, now Rampant described in his treaty of a tradition in some parts of Germany that to prevent the dead from masticating, they placed a mound of dirt under the chin on the coffin, and they placed a piece of money and stone in the mouth or tied a handkerchief lightly around the throat. In 1732, an anonymous writer, writing as to Dr. Weimer, discusses the non-putrefaction of these creatures from a theological point of view. In 1733, Johann Christoph Herrenberg wrote a general treatise on vampirism, and the Marquis and then the Marquis d'Argens cites local cases. Now, theologians and clergymen will also address the topic. Now, some theological disputes arose. The non-decay of vampires' bodies could recall the incorruption of the bodies of the saints of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Now, indeed, vampires were traditionally considered highly problematic within Christianity culture, as their apparent immortal existence ran against the Christian belief that all true believers may look forward to an eternal existence with body and soul, as they were resurrected. But only at the end of the time, when Jesus returns to judge the living and the dead, those who are resurrected as immortal before this are thus in no way part of the divine plan for salvation. Now, the imperfect state of the vampire body and how they, in spite of their immortal nature, still need to feed on the blood of the living, further reflected the problematic aspect of the vampires. Now, contrary to how the incorruptible saints foreshadowed the immortality promised all true Christians at the end of the time, the immortality of the undead vampires was thus not a sign of salvation, but of a perdition. Now I gotta get a haircut too. My hair's getting long. The unholy dimension of a vampire may also be reflected in how, in parts of Russia, the very word heretic was a synonymous with the vampire. Now, whoever denied, excuse me. So, but whoever denied God or his commandments became a heretic after their death. The improperly immortal figure that wandered the nights in search of freedom. A paragraph on vampires was included in the second edition, 1749, of Del Savorum de on the beatification of the servants of God and canonization of the blessed, written by Prospero Lambertini, who was also Pope Benedict the 16th. Now, in his opinion, while the incorruption of the bodies of saints was the effect of a divine intervention, all the phenomena attributed to vampires were purely natural, or the fruits of imagination, terror, and fear. In other words, he basically, Pope Benedict XVI, said that in his mind, he believed that vampires did not exist. Oh shit. Okay. Mm. Hold on. Excuse me. So in the early 18th century, despite the decline of many popular folkloric beliefs during the Age of Enlightenment, and that's actually highlighted on here, so there's a whole description of that. Um, I'm gonna have to write a lot of these words down and start doing videos on these people and other stuff too to keep everybody entertained. During the Age of Enlightenment, there was a dramatic increase in the popular belief in vampires, resulting in a mass hysteria throughout much of Europe. The panic began with an outbreak of alleged vampire attacks in East Prussia in 1721, and in the Habsburg monarchy from 1725 to 1734, which spread to other localities. Now, the first infamous vampire case involved the corpse of Peter Blagojevic from Serbia. Blagojevic was reported to have died at the age of 62, but allegedly returned after his death asking his son for food. When the son refused to give him any, he was found dead the following day, and Blagojevic supposedly returned and attacked some neighbors who died from the loss of blood. In the second case, Milo Sakar, an ex-soldier turned farmer who allegedly was attacked by a vampire years before, died while haying. After his death, people began to die in the surrounding area. It was widely believed that Milos had returned to prey on his neighbors. Now, the Blagojevic and Sakar incidents were well documented. Government officials examined the bodies, wrote case reports, and published books throughout Europe. The problem was exacerbated by rural epidemics of so-called vampire attacks, undoubtedly caused by the higher amount of superstition that was still present in these village communities, and with locals digging up bodies and in some cases staking them. Even government officials engaged in the hunting and staking of vampires. Now, the hysteria, commonly referred to as the vampire controversy, continued for many generations. At least 16 contemporary treatises discuss the theological and the philosophical implications of the vampire epidemic. Dom Augustin Calmet, a French theologian and scholar, published a comprehensive treatise in 1751 titled Treatise on the Apparitions of Spirits and on Vampires of Revenants, which instigated and analyzed the evidence for vampirism. Numerous readers, including both Voltaire, critical, and numerous demonologists supportive, interpreted the treaty as claiming that vampires existed. Now, the controversy in Austria ceased with Empress Maria Theresa. So Maria Theresa sent her personal physician, Gerald von Swieten, to investigate the claims of vampire entities. Van Swieten had concluded that vampires did not exist, and the Empress passed laws prohibiting the opening of graves and the desecration of bodies, thus ending the vampire epidemic. Other European countries followed suit. Despite this condemnation, the vampire lived on in artistic works and in local folklore. Um, beings have many of the attributes of European vampires appear in the folklore of Africa, Asia, North and South America, and India. Classified as vampires, they all share the thirst and blood. Um, the thirst for blood, basically. In Africa, various regions um, various regions of Africa have folk tales featuring beings with vampiric abilities. In West Africa, the Ashanti people tell of the iron tooth and tree dwelling um, Azambasam, and the Ewe people of the Adze, which can take the form of a firefly and hunts children at night. Um, the Eastern Cape region has the Impundulu, which can take the form of a large Italian bird and can summon thunder and lightning. And the Bestial people of Madagascar tell of the Ramanaga, um, of the Ramanga, an outlaw or a living vampire who drinks the blood and eats the nail clippings of nobles. In colonial East Africa, rumors circulated to the effect that employees of the state, such as firemen and nurses, were vampires, known in Swahili as the Wazamamoto. Um, in the Americas, the Rugaro is an example of how a vampire belief can result from the combination of beliefs. Now, here, a mixture of French and African voodoo. Um, the term Rugaro possibly comes from the French loup-garou, meaning werewolf, and it's common in the culture of the Marotos. Now, the stories of the Rugaro are widespread throughout the Caribbean islands and Louisiana in the United States. Um, Now, similar female monsters um, Sukayant of Trinidad, and the Tunda and the Patasola of Colombian folklore, while the Mapuche of southern Chile have the blood-sucking snake known as the Puchin. Um, Now, aloe vera was hung backwards behind or near a door, and it was thought to ward off vampiric beings in South American folklore. In the Aztec mythology, it describes the tale of the Cthulhu, the which is like a skull-faced spirit of those who died in childbirth, who stole children and entered into sexual liaisons with the living, and they would drive the people mad. Um, So during the late 18th and 19th centuries, the beliefs in vampires were widespread in parts of New England, particularly Rhode Island and eastern Connecticut. Um, and there are many documented cases of families disinterring loved ones and removing their hearts in the belief that the deceased was a vampire who was responsible for sickness and death in the family, although the term vampire was never used to describe the dead at that time. The deadly disease tuberculosis or consumption was, as it was known at the time, was believed to be caused by nightly visitations on the part of a dead family member who had died of consumption themselves. Now, the most famous and recorded case um, was a case of the person being suspected of vampirism is that of a 19-year-old girl named Mercy Brown, who died in Exeter, Rhode Island, in 1892. Her father, assisted by the family physician, removed her from her tomb 2 months after her death, and they cut out her heart and burned it to ashes. Um, Now, Sarah Roberts was an English woman who died and was buried in Pisco, Peru. After her death, a legend evolved that she was a vampire and bride of Dracula, but on June 9th, 1993, the 80th anniversary of her death, locals in Pisco feared that she would come back to life and take her revenge. Um, in Asia, vampires have appeared in Japanese cinema too, going from the 1950s. Now the folklore behind it is Western in origin. The Nuka-Kubi is a being whose head and neck detach from his body to fly about seeking human prey at night. Um, Legends of female vampiric beings can also detach parts of their upper body. Is also can also occur in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Um, Now there are two main vampiric creatures in the Philippines: the Tagalog Mandurugu, which means bloodsucker, and the Visayan Mananagal, which means self-segmenter. Um, the Mandurugu is a variety of the S-wang that takes the form of an attractive girl by day, and they develop wings and a long, hollow thread-like tongue by night. The tongue is used to suck up blood from a sleeping victim. The Manananggal is described as being an older, beautiful woman capable of severing its upper torso in order to fly into the night with the huge bat-like wings and prey on unsuspecting sleeping pregnant women in their homes. Um, but they use an elongated proboscis-like tongue to suck fetuses from these pregnant women. They also prefer to eat entrails, specifically the heart and the liver and the plum of sick people. um, now, now the Malaysian Pen, 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 Penag Gallon is a woman who obtained her beauty through the active abuse of black magic or other unnatural means, and is most commonly described in local folklore to be dark or demonic in nature, like almost like goth. She is able to detach her fanged head, which flies around in the night, looking for blood, typically from pregnant women. Now the Malaysians hung thistles around the doors and windows of houses, hoping that the Pangangalan would not enter for fear of catching its intestines on the thorns. Now the Layak is a similar being from the Balinese folklore of Indonesia. Um, a Kuntalanak Armatianak in Indonesia, or the Pontianak or Langsweer in Malaysia, um, is a woman who died during childbirth and they became undead, seeking revenge and terrorizing villages. She it would appear as an attractive woman with long black hair that covered a hole in the back of her neck, with which she sucked the blood of children. Now filling the hole with her hair would drive her off. Corpses had their mouths filled with glass beads, eggs under each armpit, and needles in their palms to prevent them from becoming langasir. This description would also fit the Sundal belongs. Um, Now in Vietnam, the word used to translate the word used to translate Western vampires, macarong, originally referred to a type of demon that haunts modern day food the modern day food Futho province. Now, with the communities of the Thai ethnic minority, the word was first mentioned in the chronicles of the 18th century Confucian scholar Lei Kuai-dan, um, who spoke of a creature that lives among humans, but stuffs its toes into its nostrils at night, and flies by its ears into houses with pregnant women to suck their blood. Having fed on these women, the macarong then returns to its house and cleans itself by dipping its toes into barrels of sap and wood water. Um, this allows the macarong to live undetected among humans during the day before heading out to attack again by night. Um, the Jiangxi, sometimes called Chinese vampires by Westerners, a reanimated corpse that hop around, um, killing the living creatures to absorb life essence from their victims. They're also said to be created when a person's soul fails to leave the deceased's body. The Jiangxi are usually represented as mindless creatures with no independent thought, but this monster has a greenish white furry skin, perhaps derived from fungus or mold growing on corpses. Um, the Jiangxi legends have also inspired a genre of Jiangxi films and literature in Hong Kong and Eastern Asia. Films like Encounters of the Spooky Kind and Mr. Vampire were released during the Jiangxi cinematic boom of the 1980s and 1990s. Um, this is actually a person wearing a vampire costume to make it look scary. You can see that there. So now, in modern fiction, the vampire tends to be depicted as a suave, charismatic villain. Vampire hunting societies still exist, but they are largely formed for social reasons. Allegations of vampire attacks swept throughout Malawi during the late 2002 and early 2003, with mobs stoning one person to death and attacking at least four others, including the governor Eric Chihuahua, based on the belief that the government was colluding with vampires. Fears and violence had recurred in the late 2017, with six people accused of being vampires, and they were killed. Um, Dating to early 1970, local press spread rumors of a vampire haunted Highgate Cemetery in London, England. Now, um, amateur vampire hunters flocked in large numbers to the cemetery. Now, several books have been written about the case, notably by Sean Manchester, a local man who was among the first to suggest the existence of the Highgate vampire and who later claimed to have exorcised and destroyed a whole nest of vampires in the area. Um, Dating to January of 2005, rumors circulated that an attacker had bitten a number of people in Birmingham, England. Feeling concerns about a vampire roaming the streets, local police stated that no such crime had been reported and that the case appears to be an urban legend. Um, the chupacabra means goat sucker, of Puerto Rico and Mexico is said to have been, is said to be a creature that feeds upon the flesh or drinks the blood of the domesticated animals, leading some to consider it to be a kind of vampire. Um, let's take a look at this chupacabra for a minute. I think I might have done a video on it before, but chupacabra looks like this. But there's other different variation pictures of this. Let's see. Um, so the chupacabra is supposed to look like that. Um, there's also one right here that could also be be considered a chupacabra, but who knows? Um, there's also, I think, a movie. There's a movie called Chupa, which is supposed to be centered on the chupacabra. Um, Okay, so the chupacabra hysteria was frequently associated with deep economic and political crisis, particularly during the mid 1990s. Um, in Europe, where much of the vampire folklore originates, the vampire is usually considered a fictitious being, and many communities may have embraced the revenant for economic purposes. Now, in some cases, um, specifically in small localities, beliefs are still rampant, and sightings or claims of vampire attacks occur frequently. In Romania, during February of 2004, several relatives of Petri feared that he had become a vampire, and they dug up his corpse, tore out his heart, burned it, and mixed the ashes and water in order to drink it. Um, Now, commentators have offered many theories for the origins of vampire beliefs and related mass hysteria. Everything from premature burial to the early ignorance of the body's decomposition cycle after death has been cited as the cause for the belief in vampires. Now, the pathology, like decomposition basically, author Paul Barber stated that belief in vampires resulted from the people of pre-industrial societies attempting to explain the natural, but to them, inexplicable process of death and decomposition. People sometimes suspected vampirism when a cadaver did not look as they thought a normal corpse should be when disinterred. The rates of decomposition vary depending on temperature and soil composition. Um, and many of the signs are little to well known. This has led vampire hunters to mistakenly conclude that a dead body had not decomposed at all, or to interpret signs of decomposition as signs of continued life. Um, a corpse's swallows gases from decomposition accumulates in the torso, and then the increased pressure forces blood to ooze from the nose and mouth. Now, this causes the body to look plump, well fed, and ready, and changes that are all the more striking if the person was pale or thin in life. In the Arnold Pauley case, an old woman's exhumed corpse was judged by her neighbors to look more plump and healthy than she had ever looked in life. Um, the exuding blood gave the impression that the corpse had recently been engaging in a vampiric activity. Darkening of the skin is also caused by decomposition. The staking of a swollen, decomposing body could cause the body to bleed and force the accumulated gases to escape the body. This could produce a groan-like sound when the gases moved past the vocal cords, or a sound reminiscent of flatulence when they pass through the ass. The official reporting on the Peter Blagojevic case speaks of other or Patar, sorry, Patar, Peatar. Sorry, I'm not spaced out. I'm so tired. Cases speaks of other wild signs which I pass by out of respect. The after death, the skin and the gums lose fluids and they contract, exposing the roots of the hair, nails, and teeth, even teeth that were concealed in the jaw. This can produce the illusion that the hair, nails, and teeth have grown, but at a certain stage, the nails fall off and the skin peels away, as reported in the Blagojevic case. On the dermis and the nail beds emerging underneath were interpreted as new skin and new nails, even if they weren't. Um, with premature burial, vampire legends may have also been influenced by the individuals being buried alive because of shortcomings in the medical knowledge at that time. Back then they didn't have all the medical oh shit, hold on. Back then they didn't have all the medical knowledge that we have now. Um, Basically every year the medical knowledge becomes more and more advanced with new technology. Um, so vampire legends may have been also influenced by individuals being buried alive because of shortcomings in the medical knowledge at this time. Now, in some cases in which people reported sounds emanating from a specific coffin, it was later dug up and fingernail marks were discovered on the inside from the victim trying to escape. In other cases, the person would hit their heads, noses, or faces, and it would appear that they had been feeding. A problem with this theory is the question of how people, presumably buried alive, managed to stay alive for any extended period without food, water, or any air. Um, An alternate explanation for the noise is the bubbling of escaping gases from the natural decomposition of bodies. Another likely cause of this, of, this, of, this, of, of, this, 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 Just on a second. Shit. No, the folkloric vampire has been associated with clusters of deaths from unidentifiable or mysterious illnesses, usually within the same family or the same small community. The epidemic illusion is obvious in the classical cases of Peter Petar Blagojevich and Arnold Pauli, and even more so in the case of Mercy Brown and in the vampire beliefs of New England generally, where a specific disease, tuberculosis, was associated with outbreaks of vampirism. As with the pneumonic form of bubonic plague, it was associated with the breakdown of lung tissue, which would cause blood to appear at the lips. In 1985, biochemist David Dolphin had proposed a link between the rare blood disorder porphyria and the vampire folklore. Um, 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 so noting that the condition is treated by the intravenous heme, he suggested that the consumption of large amounts of blood may result in heme being transported somewhat across the stomach wall and into the bloodstream. Thus, vampires were merely sufferers of porphyria seeking to replace heme and alleviate the symptoms. Um, Now, the theory has been rebuffed medically as suggestions that porphyria sufferers can crave the heme in human blood or that the consumption of blood might ease the symptoms of porphyria are based on a misunderstanding of the disease. Now, furthermore, David Dolphin was noted to have confused fictional blood-sucking vampires with those of folklore, and many of whom were not noted to drink blood. Now, similarly, a parallel is made between sensitivity to sunlight by sufferers, yet this is associated with the fictional and not folkloric vampires. In any case, David Dolphin did not go on to publish his work more widely, but despite being dismissed by experts, the link gained media attention and entered popular modern folklore. Um, Juan Gomez Alonso, a neurologist, examined the possible link of rabies with vampire folklore. The susceptibility to garlic and light could be due to hypersensitivity, which is a symptom of rabies. It can also affect portions of the brain that could lead to disturbance of normal sleep patterns, thus becoming nocturnal and hypersexuality. Um, the legend once said a man was not rabid if he would look at his own reflection, an illusion of the legend that vampires have no reflection. Wolves and bats, which were often associated with vampires, can also be carriers of rabies. The disease can also lead to a drive to bite others and to a bloody froth due to bloody frothing at the mouth. Um, in a psychodynamic theory, in his 1931 treatise on the nightmare, um, um, Welsh psychoanalysis Ernest Jones asserted that vampires are symbolic of several unconscious drives and defense mechanisms. Now, emotions such as love, guilt, and hate fuel the idea of the return of the dead to the grave. Desiring a reunion with loved ones, mourners may project the idea that the recently dead must, in return, yearn the same. Now, from this arises the belief that folkloric vampires and revenants visit relatives, particularly their spouses, first. Um, no good. Um, Now, in cases where there were unconscious guilt associated with the relationship, the wish for reunion may be subverted by anxiety. Now, this may lead to repression, which Sigmund Freud has linked with the development of morbid dread. Um, Jones surmised in this case the original wish of a sexual reunion may be drastically changed. Desire is replaced by fear, and love is replaced by sadism, and the object or loved one is replaced by an unknown entity. The sexual aspect may or may not be present, but some modern critics have proposed a similar theory. People identify with immortal vampires because by doing so they overcome or at least temporarily escape from their fear of dying. Um, a lot of people have a fear of dying and they don't want to die, but you know, but it's but it's the reality that we all die one day. Um, Now, Jones linked the innate sexuality and blood-sucking with cannibalism with a folkloric connection with an incubus-like behavior. Um, and he added that when more normal aspects of sexuality are regress forms may be expressed, in particular sadism. He felt that oral sadism is integral in vampiric behavior. Um, Now, for political interpretation, the reinvention of the vampire myth in the modern era is not without political overtones. Um, the aristocratic Count Dracula alone in his castle, apart from from a few demented retainers, appearing only at night to feed on his peasantry, is symbolic of the parasitic um, ancient regime. In his entry for vampires in the dictionary, but the Mosari notices how the mid 18th century coincided with the decline of the folkloric belief in the existence of vampires, but that now there were stock jobbers, brokers, and men of business who sucked the blood of the people in broad daylight, but they were not dead, though corrupted. Now, these true suckers lived not in cemeteries, but in very agreeable palaces. Um, and you can see a picture here that somebody actually drew of a vampire. This is a political cartoon of a vampire depicting the Irish National League as the Irish vampire preying on a sleeping woman. Um, Now, Karl Marx defines capital as dead labor which vampire like lives only by sucking the living labor and lives the more labor it sucks. Werner Herzog in his Nosferatu the Vampire gives this political interpretation an extra iconic twist when the pro-antagonist Jonathan Harker, a middle-class solicitor, becomes the next vampire in the way the capitalist Borgios becomes the next parasitic class. Um, in psychopathology, a number of murderers have performed seemingly vampiric rituals upon their victims. Um, Serial killers Peter Curtin and Richard Trenton Chase were both called vampires in the tabloids after they were discovered drinking the blood of the people they murdered. That reminds me of Elizabeth Bathory, because Elizabeth Bathory did the same thing. In 1932, an unsolved murder case in Stockholm, Sweden, was nicknamed the Vampire Murderer because of the circumstance of the victim's death. The late 16th century Hungarian countess and mass murderer Elizabeth Bathory became infamous in later centuries' works, which depicted her bathing in her victim's blood to retain beauty or youth, and she would also drink it too. Um, and here's a bat in Peru. Um, that's supposed to be a vampire bat in Peru. Is that even a um? Now, with vampire bats, although many cultures have stories about them, vampire bats have only been recently become an integral part of the traditional vampire folklore. Um, Vampire bats were integrated into vampire folklore after they were discovered on the South American mainland in the 16th century. There are no vampire bats in Europe, but bats and owls have long been associated with the supernatural and omens, mainly because of their nocturnal habits. Um, the three species of vampire bats are all endemic to Latin America, and there is no evidence to suggest that they had any old world relatives with human memory. Um, it is therefore impossible that the folkloric vampire represents a distorted presentation of memory of the vampire bat. The bats were named after the folkloric vampire rather than vice versa. The Oxford English Dictionary records their folkloric use in English form in 1734, and the zoological not until 1774. Um,
Nobody likes that job, so they don't.
Now the danger of rabies infection aside, the vampire bat's bite is usually not harmful to a person
but the bat has been known to actively feed on humans and large prey such as cattle and often leaves the trademark two-pronged bite mark on its victim's side. Um, the literary Dracula transforms into a bat several times in the novel, and vampire bats themselves are mentioned twice in it. The 1927 stage production of Dracula followed the novel and having Dracula turn into a bat, as did the film in the film where Bela Lugosi would transform into a bat. Um, the bat transformation scene was used again by Lon Chaney's in 1943's The Son of Dracula. Um, Now, in modern culture, the vampire is now a fixture in popular fiction. Such fiction began with the 18th century poetry and continued with the 19th century short story films. The first and most influential of which was John Polidori's The Vampire in 1819, featuring the vampire Lord Ruthven. Lord Ruthven's exploits were further explored in a series of vampire plays in which he was the anti-hero. The vampire theme continued in penny dreadful serial publications such as Varney, the Vampire in 1847, and it culminated in the preeminent vampire novel in history, Dracula by Bram Stoker, published in 1897. Um, Now, over time, some attributes are now regarded as integral became incorporated into the vampire's profile. Fangs and vulnerability to sunlight appeared over the course of the 19th century with Varney. The vampire and Count Dracula both bearing protruding teeth, and Count Orlok of Murnau's Nosferatu in 1922, fearing daylight. The cloak appeared in stage productions of the 1920s with the high collar introduced by playwright Hamilton Dean to help Dracula vanish on stage. Lord Ruthven and Barney were able to be healed by moonlight, although no account of this is known in traditional folklore. But it's implied, though, and not often explicitly documented. So it's implied, but not officially explicitly documented in folklore. Immortality is often attributed, um, is often one attribute with which features heavily in vampire films and literature, but much is made of the price of eternal life, namely the incessant need for the blood of former equals. Um, Now, the vampire of our Revenant first appeared in poems such as The Vampire in 1748 by Heinrich Alsenfelder. Lenore, which was written in 1773 by Gottfried Berger. Um, um, Die von Corinth, The Bride of Corinth in 1797, written by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Robert Southey's The Falaba, the Destroyer. John Stagg's The Vampire, which was written in 1810. Now, the Robert Southey was written in 1801. Percy Shelley's The Spectral Horseman in 1810. And now you also had the Ballad in Saint Irving in 1811 about a reanimated corpse, Sister Rosa. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's unfinished Custable, and Lord Byron's the Giaour. Now, Lord Byron was also credited with the first prose fiction the prose fiction piece concerned with vampires. The Vampire back in 1819. This is in reality authored by Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, who adapted an enigmatic fragmentary tale of his illustrious patient, fragment of a novel 1819, also known as The Burial. Byron's own dominating personality, mediated by his lover, Lady Caroline Lamb, and her unflattering Roman A. Clef, Glenavron, a Gothic fantasy based on Byron's wild life. This was used as a model for Polidori's undead protagonist, Lord Ruthven. The Vampire was highly successful and the most influential vampire work of the early 19th century. Now, Barney the Vampire was a popular mid-Victorian era Gothic horror story by James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Peckett Prest, and which first appeared from the years of 1845 to 1847 in a series of pamphlets generally referred to as penny dreadfuls because of the low price and gruesome contents. Now published in a book form in 1847, the story runs to 868 pages. It has a distinctly suspenseful style, using vivid imagery to describe the horrifying exploits of Barney. Another important addition to the genre was Sheridan Le Fano's lesbian vampire story, Carmilla, in 1871. Like Barney before her, the vampiress Carmilla is portrayed in a somewhat sympathetic light, as the compulsion of her condition is highlighted. No effort to depict vampires in popular fiction was influential or as definitive as Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was written in 1897. The portrayal of a vampire as a disease of contagious demonic possession with its undertones of sex, blood, and death struck a chord in the Victorian era and in the Victorian Europe area, where tuberculosis and syphilis were common. The vampiric traits described in Stoker's work emerged with and dominated folkloric tradition, eventually evolving into the modern fictional vampire. Drawing on past works such as The Vampire and Carmilla, Stoker began to research his new book in the late 19th century, reading works such as The Land Beyond the Forest in 1888 by Emily Gerard, and other books about Transylvania and vampires, because supposedly Transylvania is where vampires originated from, supposedly. In London, a colleague mentioned to him the story of the Vlad Tepes, the real-life Dracula, and Stoker immediately incorporated the story into his book. The first chapter of the book was omitted when it was first published in 1897, but it was released in 1914 as Dracula's Guest. Now, the latter part of the 20th century saw the rise of multi-volume vampire epics, as well as a renewed interest in the subject of books. The first of these was Gothic romance writer Marilyn Ross's Barnabas Collins series 1966 to 1971, which was loosely based on the contemporary American TV series Dark Shadows. It also set the trend for seeing vampires as poetic, tragic heroes rather than that as the more traditional embodiment of evil. The formula was followed in novelist Anne Rice's highly popular Vampire Chronicles from 1976 to 2003. And the Stephanie Meyer's Twilight series, which was written between the years of 2005 and 2008. In the 2006 Peter Watts novel Blindsight, vampires are depicted as a subspecies of Homo sapiens that predated on humanity until the dawn of civilization. The various supernatural characteristics and abilities traditionally assigned to vampires by folklore are justified on naturalistic and scientific basis. And film and television, considered one of the preeminent figures of the classic horror film genre, the vampire has proven to be a rich subject for the film, television, and gaming industries. Dracula is a major character in more films than any other but Sherlock Holmes. And many early films were either based on the novel Dracula or closely derived from it. This includes the 1922 silent film Nosferatu, which is a scene. There's a scene from here. This is a scene from Nosferatu. So this included the 1922 silent German expressionist horror film Nosferatu, directed by F.W. Murnau, and featuring the first film portrayal of Dracula, although names and characters are intended to mimic Dracula. Universal's Dracula 1931, which starred Bela Lugosi as the Count, and directed by Todd Browning, was the first Tolkien film to portray Dracula. I had a great weekend. I especially went to downtown Chicago yesterday. Spent 8 hours out there yesterday. Not the fact that I wanted to, but but seeing the sights of downtown Chicago was pretty great. Um, Hopefully, I can get back out there and do some more videos out there for the for downtown Chicago because it's a big area. Um, so the first Dracula movie to actually have a talk in person was Bela Lugosi's the Dracula back in 1931. Um, so both Lugosi's performance and the film overall were influential in blossoming the horror film genre of the vampire, and they were now able to use sound and special effects much more efficiently than in the silent film era. Um, um, Now, the influence of this 1931 film lasted throughout the rest of the 20th century and up through the present day. Stephen King, Francis Ford Coppola, Hammer Horror, and Philip Saville each have at one time or another derived inspiration from this film directly through staging or even though directly quoting the film. Particularly how Stoker's line "Listen to them, children of the night," and what music they make is delivered by Lugosi, for example. Francis Ford Coppola paid homage to this moment with Gary Oldman and his interpretation of the 1992, and King has credited this film as an inspiration for his character Kurt Barlow repeatedly in interviews. It is for these reasons that the film was selected by the U.S. Library of Congress to be in the National Film Registry back in 2000. And here's a picture of Bela Lugosi playing the Count. That's Bela Lugosi back from 1931's Count Dracula film. And this down here is, oh, that's Jonathan Frid playing the 1960 version and Dark Shadows of him. Now the legend of the vampire continued throughout the film industry when Dracula was reincarcerated and then in the pertinent Hammer horror series of films starring Christopher Lee as the Count. The successful 1958 Dracula film starring Lee was followed by 7 sequels. Christopher Lee returned as Dracula in all but 2 of these and became well known for the role. By the 1970s, vampires um, by the 1970s, vampires and films had diversified with works such as Count Yorga, Vampire in 1970, and an African Count in 1972's Blackula. The BBC Count Dracula featuring French actor Louis Jourdan as Dracula and Frank Finlay as Abraham Van Helsing, and Nosferatu like Vampire in 1979's Salem's Lot, and a remake of Nosferatu itself titled Nosferatu the Vampire with Klaus Kinski the same year. Several films featured the characterization of a female, often lesbian vampire, such as Hammer Horror's The Vampire Lovers in 1970, based on Carmelo, though the plotline still revolved around a central evil vampire character. The Gothic soap opera Dark Shadows on American television from 1966 to 1971 featured the vampire character Barnabas Collins, portrayed by Jonathan Frid, which proved partly responsible for making the series one of the most popular of its type, which amassed a total of 1,225 episodes in nearly its 5-year run. The pilot from the later 1972 television series Kolchak the Night Stalker revolved around the reporter hunting a vampire on the Las Vegas Strip. Later films showed more diversity in the plotline, with some focusing on the vampire hunters such as Blade in the Marvel Comics Blade films, and the film Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Buffy the TV show was released in 1992 and it foreshadowed a vampiric presence on television with its adaptation to a series of the same name and its spin-off Angel. Others showed the vampire as a protagonist, such as 1983's The Hunger, 1994's Interview with the Vampire, and its indirect sequel Queen of the Damned with the Leo, and the television series Moonlight. The 1992 film Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola became the highest grossing vampire film outside of Blade. this increasing interest of vampiric plot lines of the vampire plot lines led to the vampire being depicted in films such as Underworld and Van Helsing. I do like the Underworld film series. The Russian Night Watch and the TV miniseries remake of Salem's Lot both came out in 2004, and the series Blood Ties premiered on Lifetime Television in 2007. Um, um, and that's pretty much it there because, but like I said, there's been a lot of games of it. I do love the Underworld film series. I did see Van Helsing, and I do love the Blade series, which are two of the best movies if you ever want to watch movies about vampires and werewolves. Then watch Underworld. If you want to see a lot of action and a lot of martial arts stunts in the movies from and any of the vampire movies, then watch Blade. Because Wesley Snipes is a trained martial arts fighter, so he was perfect for that role, and I loved him for that, and that's what made him a really good star for that. So that's pretty much it for today. But like I said, if you want to check out my Torture Museum video on the live stream for my other channel, RBW King, you could check out the Torture Museum video, and you could see a lot of interesting stuff of when I walked through it yesterday. They did have a gift shop downstairs. Maybe when I get back out there next time, then I could go buy some stuff, like some interesting coffee mugs that have skulls on them. And I thought they were kind of cool. I wanted to buy one yesterday, but they were kind of expensive, so I'm like, I didn't want to blow through all my money. So I told the guy I'll be back again, whenever it comes time. And they had a lot of interesting stuff there, so it was kind of cool, and everything was interactive. You could touch all the stuff. Some people didn't want to touch it, but I did, and made it pretty interesting. So if you want to check out that Torture Museum video, go to RBW King and check it out. You could also subscribe to that channel too. And with the ending of this video, if you're on this channel tuning in to Rusty the King, you can also hit the like and subscribe button on this. Thanks everyone for tuning in. For the people that did, thanks for commenting too, because this helps out the video. So if you want to support my work even further, just hit the like and subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you guys thought about the video. And also, if you want to donate even further, I have a Patreon link on the About section for this channel. And if you want to support my work even further, with even a few bucks per video or something like that, it will help go a long way. And thanks for listening.